Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. This, as it says on the tin, is a show about liberalism. But teasing out what that term means can be challenging, not just because it's philosophically complex, but because common usage of terms doesn't always conform to rigorous conceptual categories. And even when it does, language evolves. That's the jumping off point for today's conversation. My guest is Samantha Hancox-Li, and she's a writer, game designer, and associate editor at Liberal Currents. We discuss what it means to be liberal and how that's distinct from being a progressive. Then we talk about what liberals can learn from progressives and where progressives sometimes go wrong in matching their political actions to their values. It's a conversation about political engagement, political rhetoric, and the right way to change the world. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported project. If you like the show and want to get early access to new episodes, consider becoming a supporter. You can learn more and sign up for the free newsletter companion to this podcast by heading to reimaginingliberty.com. And stick around to the end of today's episode for a preview of my next discussion, available now in early access for supporters. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Samantha. Liberalism appears in the tagline of this show, and it's a concept that we talk a lot about on Reimagining Liberty. But one of the interesting things, particularly in the American context, is liberalism, at least for some time, has been seen as somewhat synonymous with either the left. To be liberal means to be on the left. To be Democrat means both to be on the left and liberal, or with progressivism, that to be a progressive is to be a liberal is to be a progressive, and so on. And in the philosophical sphere, we can distinguish those some, but in contemporary kind of everyday politics talk, I think a lot of people still treat them as the same. Is that correct, or is there a difference between being a liberal and being a progressive?
So before I came on this podcast, I talked a little bit about the topic with a friend of mine, and I started giving him my spiel. And immediately he stopped me and he says, no, that's not right. You know, democratic socialist and social democracy are clearly different things, which is I said, no, but I'm trying to talk about, he said, well, you shouldn't use that word. I was like, well, what about liberal? And well, that means something else. And leftist means something else, and Christian Democrat means something else, less common in this country, more common in Europe. And I think to disagree with you, I think progressive and liberal, people will disagree with you immediately that these mean the same thing. And I think it's possible to get a little bit lost in the labels and what people exactly are meaning by them when they, the difference between people who embrace the label or who use the label as an accusation that they throw against other people, and it might not be the same thing. So I'm going to step away from that a little bit and try to talk about a slightly larger historical perspective, one way of distinguishing what liberal means, and then I'm going to qualify that a little bit. So on one view, liberalism is an idea, a way of organizing society that emerges in the 1700s and 1800s in Britain, later the United States, later France, based around ideas of democracy, of human rights, limited government. And this form of social organization basically wins out over all of its competitors over the course of the 20th century. And, when I say competitors, what I mean are movements like fascism, movements like communism in the Soviet style, fundamentally different ways of organizing society. And Francis Fukuyama, he writes his book, The End of History, and he says there aren't really any intellectual competitors left to this way of organizing society. But within that box of liberal democracy, there's still a lot of questions to be answered about how do you organize society. And So sometimes when people say liberal, they just mean that, the really big box, the terrain that we're all operating in. Um, but then sometimes they mean something much more specific than that. And I think the way it gets contrasted with progressive rather than identified with progressive is the sense in which liberalism after Fukuyama in the Clinton years, even, in the Bush years and the Obama years, liberalism, you could argue, kind of stood not for a philosophical position, but a temperamental one. Um, that not just the biggest questions had been solved, but like pretty much all of them had been solved. And we were just going to tinker around the edges a little bit. We weren't really going to try and interfere with the economy too much or trying to do anything too radical with it. Weren't really going to interfere with the electoral system as it existed, the political system. It all kind of works. So, who wants to make any major changes? So, an intellectual, it's like a temperamental tendency towards institutionalism, towards moderation, towards not changing things too much. And so I think that kind of temperament is what people mean when they use liberal as an epithet. And they say, no, I'm not a liberal, I'm a progressive, or I'm a leftist. Sometimes that, though, can bleed a little further out into opening up some of those big questions that I said were all settled. People who call themselves leftists, but they don't really mean that they're on the left within the big box of liberalism. They mean, I actually do want to change fundamental things about how do we organize our economy or politics or other kinds of things. So that's kind of how I see the terrain of meaning that we're talking about here in terms of liberal and progressive. And I've talked too much, so now it's your turn.
That opens up so many possible avenues for follow-up questions. So let me think through this a bit. So the first one, maybe we'll start here, is, were liberals right to think that they had, in that Fukuyama Clinton era, that they had solved politics effectively?
No. So I think, again, in the very big picture, communism is dead. Fascism is dead. These ways of, the imperial commonwealth, that's dead. Arguably, authoritarian capitalism of the kind you see in China, in Russia, in places like Hungary, arguably that remains as a competitor to liberal democracy. I think in 10 years and 20 years, certainly, no one will think it is a competitor to liberal democracy. So in that sense, I think Fukuyama was right, that there are no competitors to liberalism in the big tent sense. Were the Clinton-era liberals right that there were no more important political questions and that they had gotten them all right? Absolutely not. And I think we're seeing a lot more of that today. Whether, again, it's a challenge from the Democratic Socialist side of the party. The Niskanen Center actually just has a piece out talking about the new abundance agenda and how they want to organize a new faction within the Democratic Party that takes aim at a lot of the traditional orthodoxies of the Clinton era, liberal package. And I agree with a lot, and I agree with the critique from the left of a lot of what's happening in this country, and I agree with the proposals of the abundance liberals. So I think there remains a lot to be done. Just to maybe to deliver this more clearly, I think one of the great values of the progressive, like the new progressive energy, has been to shake the liberalism out of its complacence. To remind us that, just because we had answered the fundamental questions doesn't mean we had answered all of the questions. Doesn't mean that we had arrived at the final and correct system, and that there is still a lot of work to be done.
That seems to get at one of the other avenues that I was thinking of to follow up on your first answer, which is if we look at people, so take people who self-describe as liberal, who would say, I am a representative of the liberal tradition,
Okay.
but who are skeptical of progressivism or kind of emerging, even say like democratic socialism or the ideologies that are represented by the squad. Uh, it seems like there are two avenues of objection that are most common. So one would be the one that I might take, which is this brand of progressivism is a little too sanguine about state power and a little bit naive about what it means to exercise state power, even if your goals for that exercise are admirable. That the state basically the state is more a tool of oppression than it is a tool of liberation than these people think.
So, I mean, I agree with that entirely. And I think he's like, there's a great crux you can kind of see in, for example, the degrowth movement, um, where on the one hand, they are proposing enormous government intrusion into society. I mean, fundamentally, what we're talking about is a managed recession, for the foreseeable future. And that is going to require an enormous amount of government control over the economy. And they're totally blithely endorsing this without really looking into the history of like how's it worked in the past when we've had this level of government control over the economy. The answer is not very well. Um, is this going to require an enormous amount of coercive control? And they'll say, no, of course not. It's all going to be locally democratically decided. And that citizens councils across the country are all going to like unanimously consent to a program of managed perception. And that is, simultaneously, endorsing an enormous program, but also like naive about what it would require to do any of that, to implement any of that, either economically or politically. So, I mean, in that respect, absolutely, I agree that there are factions in what you would call the progressive side of the big tent that I really disagree with.
And maybe one way to frame that and to put it in contrast with the other kind of anti-progressive self-described liberalism, um, is they are pointing out, they're saying, okay, liberalism, the liberal order, has achieved a certain set of things. There's good aspects of it, but there are problems internal to it that need to be addressed. So we can't kind of settle for the status quo because the status quo is either unsustainable or contains a sufficient number of things that contradict liberal goals that we should do something about it. And so maybe that is environmental degradation means that it's unsustainable, or inequalities have risen to a level that is morally ill-advised and unsustainable, and so on. Um, but there's another strain of criticisms of progressivism from within a self-consciously liberal perspective or a self-identified liberal perspective, which aims at a different set of progressive critiques. So there's a set of progressive critiques, and this is what we might like get labeled wokeism, that says, hey, liberal society has all this awesome stuff, but the status quo is one of unjustified and unjustifiable power relationships, hierarchies, varying statuses, exclusion, marginalization of certain groups, certain categories of people, etc. And if you're like, you committed principled liberal should be aware of or awake to these these bad features of contemporary society, and it's we should be pushing back against those. We should be looking to ameliorate those. And so it's a critique of the status quo, but it feels like there's a sizable contingent, and like maybe the epicenter of this is like the New York Times editorial page that we might call like kind of the reactionary centrist liberals, who are like, they don't put it in these terms, but they're like, I'm comfortable in that status quo. It either benefits me or it feels familiar, or any change from it is a little bit destabilizing, or the people who are pushing against it are weird, and maybe not a JD Vance way, but a way that I still find to be a little bit weird. And I don't like it. And therefore, the people who are pointing out these problems with the current liberal status quo are themselves anti-liberal, are a threat to the good portions of liberalism, rather than trying to ameliorate in an effective or potentially ineffective ways the bad parts of the contemporary liberal status quo. But those seem to be like very, very different objections to progressivism.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, as I don't know if you know, I recently wrote an article at Liberal Currents about wokeism. I think it's just in defense of wokeism, where I argue that, the core insights of the woke move, I mean, whatever, I can't keep saying wokeism, but the core insights of wokeism, I guess I'm going to keep saying it, are correct. We clearly do live in a society where racism is still with us. We live in a society where patriarchy is still with us, where enormous and in many cases clearly unjustified inequalities of wealth are still with us. Um, I think that's all true. And I mean, just to speak from a personal perspective here, I'm trans. I remember what it was like to grow up in the 90s. What it was like to be a little queer kid in the 90s. And it was not like it is today. It was much worse. Um, uh, Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. There's a blast from the past, right? Um, the way he proves that the villain is that he pulls down her pants and reveals that she's trans. And afterwards, everyone's like, well, of course, obviously she's evil, right? That this was like, that was like my first exposure as a child to like what even is trans. Right. So I think the movement for greater awareness and greater equality of, whatever, against bigotry and prejudice are enormously valuable, right? And they're not finished by any means. So, I mean, that, like you say, there are people out there at the New York Times, I don't really want to name a lot of names, who fundamentally, I think, are just, you know, like you say, they're just made uncomfortable by some of this stuff. They don't like it. They don't like to think about it, and like, they get mad about it. And I mean, I don't really have a lot to say about those people. Like, what is there to say? Um, I think the other critiques of progressivism you describe are much more interesting to me, because I do think that there are, as I discuss in this essay on wokeness, there are excesses. There are people whose woke politics isn't really for anything. They're not fighting for anything. They don't want to materially change society. They want to be mad online. And I think that can bleed over into a kind of do nothing progressivism. Um, so for like to recapitulate some of the arguments of this essay, there's something I call the social justice game, where I propose a change to society. And you associate that change with some real or completely imagined harm to a marginalized person. And then I lose. And that's it. You don't actually need to argue that it would be bad full stop, or that it would actually lead to that outcome. You just make this chain of associations. Um, and I think, I mean, this is very familiar. I don't need to spend too much time online. But you see it all over the progressive policy world. Speed cameras are a great example where, you associate speed cameras to, they hand out more traffic tickets to minorities, and therefore they're racist and we shouldn't have them. But the reason that they hand out more traffic tickets to minorities isn't that the cameras are biased. It's that minorities tend to be poor. Poorer people tend to live in areas with unsafe road design. As a result, they tend to get more traffic tickets, but also speed cameras work and they protect the people who live in those areas who are poor and minority for the most part. And so there's no, and so I think speed cameras are a good idea. And what frustrates me about the progressive opposition to them is that there is none of that cost benefit analysis going on there. No sense of like, we want to change society. Here are the actual costs and benefits of the changes we want to make. Well, no, you just associate every change with something bad and you fundamentally become a party of the status quo. Um, which I think is kind of an interesting dynamic. Again, how people who present themselves as radical critics of the status quo wrap around to just opposing any attempts to change it. I think is kind of a paradox, but an intelligible one.
Is that attitude or that behavior, the social justice game, as you label it, a result of, I guess, call it attitudinal issues, in the sense that the people who are playing the social justice game are playing it because they value playing the social justice game more than moving the world in a better direction? Or is it empirical in the sense that they have not, in kind of like a Bastiat seen and unseen sense, you talk to them about like the traffic cameras, they're just entirely unaware of these other the other aspects of the traffic cameras conversation, and so they're essentially, it's like an anchoring thing. Like they think of the first way that this could be harmful to whatever their favorite group is, and then they lack they lack the fuller picture necessary to work through the policy questions.
I think the answer is both. Um, there's a book by Jonathan Smucker, Hegemony How To. He's a longtime leftist activist. And he critiques a lot of the leftist groups that he was a part of for fundamentally the people who were involved in them were involved with them in order to be involved with them, in order to maintain their own sense of being a righteous leftist activist. And what you're doing when you play the social justice game is you are reaffirming your place in the group by kicking somebody else out of it, right? That you are reinscribing the boundaries of the group and you're making sure that you're on the right side of that boundary. And the theories and the data, I mean, whether it's Marxism or Campism or degrowth or, various other kinds of standpoint epistemology, um, people just pick those up like tools, right? You don't need to believe all of them or even understand all of them. You find the tool that'll let you make the social move that you want to make. And I think the same thing is true of what you're talking about, the partial data or a partial picture. You find the data that you need to use as a social tool and you move on, right? You don't bother with the larger comprehensive analysis because that's not really the point of what you're doing.
Is this what's going on then with a lot of anti-market views among the progressive left? Because like I'm a pro markets guy for a lot of reasons, and one of the primary reasons is because I think that markets are this incredible tool for liberation from social hierarchy and power structures, and that they're the best mechanism we've found yet for helping the people who have suffered from those and are on the bottom to improve the quality of their lives and to have their lives improved through positive externalities and so on. And that I get frustrated with friends on the left who, it's like, guys, this tool, like, you should be all in on this because this is the best way to achieve what you say matters to you. But a problem with markets is they're kind of indirect in their effects, that it's easy to see the person who lost their job because of whatever shift in the market happened. It's easy to point to the Elon Musks as bad guys, or the billionaires who seem to have gotten their wealth through unjust means and so on. But it's harder to like point to the everyone's better off than we used to be, except in like an abstract sense. And so just being, it feels like in this way, like you mentioned, they just kind of have this toolkit of things they can grab to justify. And it feels like being anti-markets is this like hip and trendy. I've identified a problem and I can just blame it on capitalism. And then I've identified a bad guy and I feel good about myself, but there's not, I'm rambling a bit, but like I remember reading like Mark Fisher. He's dead now, but he was very prominent and influential, like Marxist, contemporary Marxist writer who wrote a very interesting book called Capitalist Realism. That's like a classic of contemporary Marxism. And he goes through and he identifies all these problems in society that often are like real problems in society, and then says, and this is the fault of capitalism, but never seems to do the work of like, well, does this problem exist in non-capitalist societies or not? Does it exist in pre-capitalist societies or not?
Well, that's the beauty of these theories, right? That's the beauty of all of these theories that are popular. The reason these theories become popular for these social reasons is because they let you skip that step, right? You don't actually need to know a lot about the particulars. You don't need to marshal some kind of real causal reasoning. You just point to a bad thing and you say, and by the way, the answer is capitalism, or the answer is imperialism, or racism. To go back to something you were saying earlier in this question, I think this gets to a bit of what I was talking about the way the blurring of the boundaries between, like, am I making a criticism within the box of liberalism, or am I criticizing liberalism? Do you criticize some, like you say, Elon Musk and his adventures, or other aspects of our society and say, well, I accept the basic liberal framework, but I want to change that, fix that? Or do you say, and therefore we need to, it's markets fundamentally, or it's democracy, or whatever your particular bugbear is, and we need to tear that down? So these things can blend into each other. But I think, to me, what this really speaks to be a bit more positive about it, is the need to read more history, to understand, what is, like I said at the outset, what is liberalism? How is it distinguished from its competitors? What effects did it have in the world? Like you say, to make everyone's lives better off, dramatically better off over the long run through these mechanisms, to understand how actually does our world work in order to improve it, not in order to sit on the sidelines and criticize.
But isn't that, I can imagine someone responding that that's an awfully privileged position to take in this sense. Like, so I don't agree with this argument, but I think this is like one way that you might respond to that is there are a lot of people who want to engage in politics, who have identified problems in the world that they think need solving, who want to make active efforts to improve the world. That's all good. Like what we don't want to say is, look, unless you have read as many history books as me, just stay out of politics. We don't want like the epistocracy, as it sometimes gets called. But it simply is the case that most people don't have the opportunity to put in that much, to have like the deep understanding of the evolution of economies and state over 500 years of history or whatever it is. And so without that, what is the right way to act upon? I have identified a real problem in the world and I want to do something about it in like an admirable way, but I don't have the time to go about reading history and economics and sociology and psychology and so on.
Well, so there's sort of two aspects to this question. I mean, one of them is just to start with the point that I think the truth matters, right? I mean, there are people out there who think they've identified a problem and they want to do something about that. And I meet them all the time at community feedback meetings, and they think the problem, is that housing is too expensive and therefore we should build less of it. Um, and it's like, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that they haven't thought about politics, or that they haven't identified a problem but they're wrong about the solution, and I'm going to oppose that. More generally, I agree with you that not everybody wants to spend all their time reading books about the history, about economic history, and that's fine. It's the part of the job of effective political movements is to mobilize people, to educate people, and to provide them with what you might call an intellectual playbook that enables them to understand the world they're living in and what's going wrong with it without necessarily, having read every single study that went into the construction of that playbook. I think the YIMBY movement, which I'm a part of, has been very effective at this. That, there are a lot of YIMBY activists out there. Not all of them have read a ton of economic history, but, they've read enough to not just identify a problem, but to have a diagnosis of that problem. And in practice, that diagnosis is connected to is organizationally, institutionally connected to a real empirically supported intellectual tradition. How to say this? There's a point from the philosophy of science that not every scientist does every experiment. Scientists could never get anywhere if every scientist was doing every experiment and verifying science from the ground up. Science works because it is a social structure that organizes people in a way that transmits empirical research in a verifiable way, that transmits truth to people all across the organizational structure, even if they themselves don't really understand it or haven't done the experiments. And I think there's something similar to be said about political organizing, that you want to have an organized political party that is in touch with genuine understanding of the world. And then not everybody needs to have the full package in their head all the time. They need to have their little piece of it when they go out and do their own political activities or when they go into the voting booth.
One problem with accomplishing that came to mind is it feels like so what you're advocating is that people should engage with politics as policy, and that policy is a set of ideas that we can explore the effectiveness and ramifications of, we can recognize expertise in, so we can defer to those who know more than us and so on, but it is engaging at the level of policy ideas. But it feels like, and I think this gets even to some of the objections that I mentioned among, like, say, self-identified liberals against self-identified progressives and so on, is politics talk feels less about ideas and more about there are people who have ideas. And which group of people are we, like, do you belong to? And then the ideas are just a labeling of that group. So to be a progressive is to hold a certain set of values, and those values are how you distinguish yourself from people who don't share those values, which is an important distinction when depending on the values. But it also then means that the way those values manifest is to have a certain set of policy preferences.
So, to kind of interrupt you here, what I described, it was not meant to be descriptive. There are many ways of engaging with politics that do not have that structure. Has the whole business of the social justice game is about, does not involve too much contact with the empirical. And like you say, I think there are certainly in this country, certainly in the history of this country and other countries, there have been political parties that are more about identity, in many cases, ethnic identity, rather than anything we would identify as like a coherent intellectual policy program. When I talk about an organized faction, you want to be in contact with an intellectual tradition, you want to deliver a playbook to your practitioners, you want to push the needle on policy. This isn't a general description of politics. This is a prescription for how do we do politics better in America.
Yes. And so I think what I'm driving at is it seems like the biggest barrier to achieving that prescriptive goal, to saying here's a better way to engage with politics than you have, is that politics right now is so quintessentially identitarian. Not in the, like, strictly identity politics way, but in the way that we have come politics is so all-consuming that a huge portion of our identity is baked into our political, there's those studies that are fascinating where you can say, like, if depending on how someone identifies, like, if do they identify as conservative or progressive, you can predict with extraordinary degrees of accuracy, like, what kind of music they're likely to be into, how they decorate their house, where they live. Like, it's remarkable how much of, like,
I can see those bookshelves in your background. It's
yes, like all of these things that seem to have nothing to do with your views on housing policy fall out of or are tied, like, can be predicted from your views on housing policy. And that seems like a real problem, and it seems like, so if we think about, say, wokeism, and so we're trying to convince the writers on the New York Times editorial page to take some of the concerns that woke people are raising more seriously versus being dismissive of them. Part of the barrier that you have is the disruption of the status quo, and that an op-ed writer for the New York Times is relatively comfortable within the status quo. But part of it is those are the ideas that are held by people who are different from me, who are weird, who are I had a did a conversation a while back on the show with the ACLU's Jillian Brandstetter about transgender issues, and she talked a lot about how it's for a lot of people, it's just perceived as a boundary crossing, and boundary crossings make them uncomfortable. And
That's
and
not.
so if it's like these arguments are coming from someone who is making me uncomfortable because they're engaged in boundary crossings, and so if I am on board with those arguments or I take them seriously, it makes me kind of like one of them, or I want to distinguish myself from one of them. That seems like a really challenging environment to have the kind of productive policy conversations and the, like, learning from each other that you're advocating.
Well, it's never going to be easy. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, again, uh, uh, like I said, I am trans, and the history of the gay rights movement has been honestly one of the things that I really try to draw from when I write about effective political organizing, because frankly, there aren't very many of us, and we are a little bit different, and we are a little bit weird. Um, you could have told somebody 40 years ago, man, it seems really hard. There's boundary crossing, and people are uncomfortable with you, and they were, and we, kept on pushing on the boulder. And what we fundamentally won was not like, you know, a war in the streets, but a war in the soul, a war over ideas. To prove to people that like we were fine, actually. Like if we weren't coming for your kids or like trying to tear down society. We're all just people trying to live our lives. And that message worked. And that message won. It took a long time, a lot of struggle, a lot of direct action, a lot of action in the streets, but we won in the world of ideas. And I think, I think you can see similar things going on in housing policy. Like I said, I don't know if I talked about this. Niskanen has a new article out about plans for organizing around the abundance agenda. And basically, they say, and I agree, that, you got to win the war of ideas. Um, and, what are we doing here on this podcast, right? Who listens to this podcast? You start not by, I don't know. Um, it's not like there's a snapshot of the world in time and people's tribal reactions to this and that never moves. It moves a lot. And it moves because of this kind of political organizing, this kind of political action. You just keep on pushing on the boulder.
It would seem then that the social justice game makes that harder.
Yeah.
Like, is that itself should be pushed back on pretty hard, because what that tells, if you're someone, so let's say you're someone who is skeptical of some of these like woke arguments, and you see that it is that the people who are engaging in those arguments are playing the game that you described, then that is a permission for you to dismiss the arguments, right? Like you can just say, and
I think
this
that's
shows up a lot there was that period where the big thing was like signaling. And you just accuse your opponent of saying this because they're signaling versus having an argument. And so how do you, I guess for listeners of the show, so people who would think of themselves as liberal, but maybe there's some people among the audience who are fairly skeptical of, say, wokeism or these ideas, like they think that, anti-racism maybe goes too far sometimes with declaring all sorts of things problematic, or that maybe we're a little bit too quick to cancel people, or whatever whatever the version of it happens to be. How would you say they should approach these kinds of ideas if what they're seeing is a lot of the social justice game?
so for me. I'm going to say something very contentious here. Um, I personally struggled with this recently with the war in Gaza, with the question of Israel and Palestine, that I found the tactics a lot of a lot of the Gazan in the pro-Palestinian, pro-Gaza encampments really distasteful. Counterproductive, certainly, but just fundamentally, like, what? Why are you spray painting a library, right? Why are you like smashing up like some random administrator's office, right? Why are you spray painting Hamas is coming on, whatever monument they spray painted that on recently? I find, waving up Hamas flag. I found that stuff incredibly off-putting. But there's a point when you have to like stop like obsessing over your interlocutor as a person and just cleave to the fundamental issues, cleave to truth and justice. And like, obviously October 7th, a horrific crime, Hamas, they're no good, man. But like the Palestinian people need a state. Like they don't have one. They need one pretty desperately, because like this is how you become a normal part of the international community. And there's just never going to be peace until there is liberal democracy on both sides of that border, right? So for me personally, the way I try to deal with these things, like it's very easy to get emotional and to get lost in your own emotions and your own social threat about what other people are accusing you of, is just to return to liberal fundamentals, to fundamental rights of humanity, the importance of democracy, your particular understanding of, some of this, theory we talked about in terms of economic history, like what actually works. And just like get your head out of the debate, get your head out of the noise of social media and focus on the truth.
Thank you for joining us today. Now, here's a preview of the next episode of Reimagining Liberty, currently in early access for supporters.
These voters in the Republican Party aren't going to go away. They believe that everyone is out to get them. All the elections are rigged against them. They're only going to get more extreme and more reactionary in a response to an environment where they continue to lose. So maybe that means those people leave the system and new voters come into the Republican Party and it moderates. But I don't think these voters are leaving. They don't have anywhere to go. It's impossible to know the future, but I think it's probably going to get worse in the GOP before it gets better. If the RNC is going to grow, it's going to grow on the far left extreme. These progressives that maybe have shared policy goals like immigration restrictionism and isolationism and The whole Israel thing is actually a really big deal. It's a big fracture point right now on the left. I kind of see those people migrating over in time to actually be more Republican aligned because of these new coalitions. So again, it is impossible to know, but I think the trajectory is not good. It's going to get worse before it gets better for the GOP. Whether they double down or not is unclear.
If you'd like to listen to that conversation right now, you can by becoming a Reimagining Liberty supporter. Head to reimaginingliberty.com and click on Early Access to learn more.